Welcome to the Grungy Resin Opals tutorial by Fanciful Devices. In the description box below, you'll find a list of materials as well as timestamps to navigate the video. To make these beauties, you'll need UV resin. Any brand is the same. I like a big bottle with a little nozzle that I can pour into some small containers. I like to use the bottoms of beer or soda cans just so that I have a small amount and I don't throw more plastic out into the world. Here you can see I have a very dirty old UV curing lamp for nails. It happens to be 24 watts. Now they come up to 120 watts. And the amount of watts will tell you how fast it goes, but mine works fine. You'll need an array of head pins, and you can use eye pins, flat ones, ball ones, or if you don't have them, you can also just use wire, or maybe you want a special color or gauge. I just cut a piece and bend the end. For bigger drops, you'll need little base beads like these, cornstarch, in another little container. Here I'm using an old jar lid to dip my fingers into as we go along, and also to clean up any drips. An old rag or paper towel, a candle lighter is helpful, and finally a clean area to work on that you can get dirty. I use parchment paper. Most importantly, you'll need nail art chameleon flakes. That's chameleon flakes. They're just thin as air, so they produce such a completely transparent opal glow. Some are clear iridescent and only reveal their true color against a dark background, and some are dark, but all of them produce beautiful results. They're available online on eBay or Amazon or Etsy, usually for less than $2 a little pot. Let's start by pouring a little bit into our container. Pick your color. Some have bigger flakes, some are more powdery. Make sure you only have one pot open at a time. Even a strong breath can blow them all over the place. Make sure your lamp is aimed away from your resin or it'll cure. I'm going to dip the end of, I'm using an eye pin. You see I have just the tiniest bit. I'm going to dip it into my flakes, give it a little tap. It looks like this. I'm going to turn my lamp on and stick it in for 1 second. You can see there's like a funky little side to it, which is going to make my drop extra wonky. So now is the perfect time to shape it a little bit into a more round glob. It'll look like that. So now I'm going to re-dip it into my resin, and then I put it back. Again, you only need a second here because you're not curing it fully. You're just curing it enough so that you can do the next layer. And as I dip my next layer, you can see that there's always an extra drop that you have to remove, or you'll end up with a very wonky shape. A couple more dips and this one will be done, at which point I hold it under the lamp for about 2 to 3 times longer than usual. You'll notice it's very shiny, so I'm going to give it a little bit of a matte or frosty finish just by using my fingers. So I just dip my fingers into my baking soda, rub them together, and wipe most of it off on my rag or paper towel, and then sort of finger it all on there. And if I do too much, it'll end up opaque, but if I do just enough, it'll glow. Here I'm using a different color without closing my first pot. I dip and tap, and then you see that with these bigger flakes, I get an even wonkier shape. But I just fix it after my first curing and get a little rounder. So I continue to dip, tap off that little excess, and cure for like a second. Dip again, tap off any excess, cure, and continue until I'm happy with the size. Here I notice that I have a resin glob coming out sideways. I just cut it with my wire cutters till I like the shape, and then I just dip it again in resin, and the problem is fixed. I'm happy with the size and shape, so I hold it under the lamp a couple more seconds and I mattify with my fingers, which is working without any baking soda this time. I like to test it with just my fingers first so I don't overdo it before going straight to the baking soda. And when I'm happy, I leave the pin under the lamp to cure all the way through. Although if you have a stronger lamp, you probably don't need to worry about this. Again, we'll make another one, dipping into the resin, dipping into the flakes, tapping, going into the lamp for just a second, shaping a little bit over the flakes, dipping back into the resin, tapping off the excess, back into the lamp, back into the resin, tapping, and back into the lamp. Repeat until you like the size. Then hold your pin to your lamp for longer to more fully cure. Then press it with your forefinger and thumb to mattify. And if it doesn't work, dip your finger into your baking soda, rubbing your fingers together, and then rubbing most of that off on your rag and fingering all over there till you get a nice matte surface. Then let it sit in your lamp while you do the next one and it finishes curing fully. Remembering that any drippy mistakes can be fixed with your pliers and another dip in the resin. After a while, you'll see some flakes and some bubbles in your resin, and that's fine. The bubbles are barely visible, but they can easily be removed with a candle lighter. The extra tiny flakes will add dimension to the outer layers of your drops, and if you get way too many flakes in there, just pour a new little pot of resin and just finish up the first pot as the first couple layers and use the clean new resin as the last few layers. To make bigger drops, I'm going to use little core beads. These are about 6 millimeters and they can be any kind or any color. I'm just going to put it on my pin, dip into the resin, and then dip into the flakes as usual, being a little extra careful that the bead is right against the pin head before I go into my lamp. Because these are bigger, it's easier to sort of misform the shape with a big drop of resin falling off of it. So be sure to tap it well before you go into your lamp as you build up the layers. I'm going to go into my little clean pot after this layer because it's looking really messy there. And you might notice in this larger one that the flakes look like they're much closer to the surface. So we'll need a little bit more baking soda to produce a good matte surface at the end. Dipping into the baking soda, wiping off, dabbing my fingers all over it until I like how it looks, then making sure I get baking soda on the top edges of my fingers so that I can mattify the bottom edge of the bead. Try not to forget this step on your larger drops, and when you're happy with the result, just leave it in the lamp to fully cure while you work on your next ones. We can also make really tiny drops using just wire that I don't bend at the end or anything, just dipping the wire straight in and following our same process, only you only need about 3 to 4 layers, so you can make tons of them really fast. Here's a pair of earrings I made with just the tiny drops. These next pins get all that flash from having black base beads. I start with about 8 millimeter black bead of any kind. I use the kind of flakes that look almost white in the bottle, and when I dip into the resin and the flakes, I don't go all the way in, so a tiny bit of the black base is still showing. Again, these are quite large, so big flakes will really stick on there and make a big mess of your shape, so be careful to really shape it round And when you dip your resin also, really make sure to tap off any excess. It takes quite a few layers to make these look good because they are quite big. And in the end, they'll take a decent amount of baking soda covered fingers, remembering again to get the top edges of your fingers in order to mattify the bottom edge of this drop. A little troubleshooting for you. Here there's dark printing that's dissolving into my resin, and I just stir it up and it disappears. Sometimes your drops can look quite dusty, and you can just rinse off the extra baking soda and then just dry it. But if your problem is that you overdid it with the mattifying step and you can't see anything, no problem. Just stick it back in the resin, back in the lamp, and you'll be able to see all those flakes again. And you'll probably only need a little bit of mattifying after that. Now, if you have a globby mess at the base of your drop, you can just ignore it, or you can break it with your pliers and sort of twist it off. Usually when I make my wrapping connecting loop, they come off on their own, and I just pull off the little bit left hanging. Now that we have several different sizes, we can work on our first project, which will be these hoops. I arranged my drops by size. I'll be using thin chain and some hoops I actually made myself out of thin, non-tarnish memory wires with careful sanding at the ends. I wrap my drops directly on the chain so I don't need to mess with jump rings. And now it's time to figure out how long my chain should be, which takes a little eyeballing for me. I start with more chain than I think I'll need. I'm putting my chains directly on my hoop. After deciding how long I want one drop to be, I put the next drop with one or two more links on my chain. And I look and make sure I like where it's falling. Then I clip off the chain without removing it from my hoop to make sure I'm cutting the right link. I'm using little spacers to make sure my drops don't all tangle up with each other. You can use beads. You can even make little wraps of wire. You can use jump rings if you have tiny ones. And at the end, I really tightened the last spacer so that all the elements wouldn't just fall right off the hoops. Now, if you want more colorful pins, you can, of course, get more colorful flakes. I thought these would be absolutely neon, but I was very pleasantly surprised to find the results kind of pastel and quite soft and pleasing. But if you have specific beads you want to use with them, you'll need something customizable, which is where you have the option of trying alcohol inks. So for example, these little drops I created by mixing Ranger ink denim with Marabou ink garnet red. You don't need all the colors if you just try mixing. I'm going to try some soft beige inks to use with this vintage sugar bead I have, and I just drip it straight on, rub it around on my finger. Of course you can use some protective gloves, but I never do. And when I'm done, my result is similar enough in color where it's not too exact matchy-matchy and still a bit interesting. You're not done yet. Bear with me. We're going to use some isopropyl alcohol, dip the paintbrush straight in there, and then paint that all over our beads, rubbing the ink off on a cloth. And you're saying, why would I undo the work of painting it? But if you compare it to our original piece, the color's still there. but more subtle and deep. I'm gonna paint a drop for this plummy pink bead, and I think this dark garnet red might actually work. Not right away, but when I remove a lot of that color with my isopropyl alcohol. Oh, I just think it looks so good. And I think it's perfect for this bead too. I clean up just by pouring some alcohol onto my rag and rubbing my fingers all over it, and that gets rid of most of it. If there's any left, I'll rub oil, any kind of oil, all over my hands and then scrub that off. Soap and water and a little scrubby sponge. Now we can use our new inking skills to create these little earrings, which I think are very cute. I'm using 18 gauge brass wire, cutting off 2.5 inches. Then I'm bending the ends and making sure those little end loops are straight, like so. And then I'm folding them in the middle on my round nose pliers. And I just eyeball it to make sure I'm folding them truly in the middle. This one side's a little longer, so I'm going to pull that one as I make my loop in the middle. I'm going to make the loop a little smaller, and then I'm going to curve the two sides a little bit to get that nice, I don't know, it makes me think of a Chinese lantern shape. For my second piece, again, I fold it in half on my round nose plier, and you can actually see here where I'm using my finger to create that curve and keep it soft. And after fussing around a bit, I check that they both look the same, and I'm ready for my resin. We're gonna do the same exact thing, except this time, once you're done with one side, you turn it around and start on the other side. As always with earrings, we have to stop to compare that everything is the same size. And when we're done with our components, it's time for ink. Again, just drop it on with my hands, rub it all around. I dip my paintbrush in isopropyl alcohol and then paint off a lot of that ink, mixing different colors whenever necessary. I decided to add some bead caps, and I'm connecting my lower drops directly to my focal bead with a simple wrap. I used 2 jump rings to connect my focal to my top bar to give it a little space, and then I used a very tiny jump ring to connect a chain. I'm eyeballing how long I want my drape to be, and when I'm happy with the length, I clip it, but before I connect the other end, I connect the chain to my second earring so that I can compare the two very carefully and get the same length of chain. I love the results, but what if you want to hang it wide like this and you're brave? You can put a tiny drop of resin at the base of your opal to secure the jump ring. You have to hold it in place under the lamp without getting resin under the connection on the chain, or it'll stiffen at a weird angle. And when you're done, ooh mama, that's sexy. Now that you know how to make double-ended pins, you can use those to get creative like I did with these earrings, again made out of tin because I'm obsessed with tin. And this bracelet, I used a double-ended head pin to create a hinge. I also removed the original cabochon on this vintage Gucci pendant, put in my own drop, cutting out the wire at the back and filling in the rest with a little more resin. It's just so neato. Now let's try some variations we can make using the same technique but just a couple different ingredients. Like I used this really big bead to get this really big drop, and it was translucent, and I really liked it. Another thing I tried is using mica pigment powders like Perfect Pearls and even old eyeshadows. Look at this one. I used pink at the base, and then after a couple layers of resin, I dipped it in this light blue, and then another final resin layer over without the mattifying at the end. I think it looks so cool. You can even use pressed eyeshadow by scratching a little bit up to make a powder. To make these, I'll start with a little bead, and once I dip into my resin, I'm actually going to go straight to my lamp before dipping into my powder because I want it sticky, not wet. It'll get everywhere. I give it a really good tap, and then I clean off a lot of it on my finger, or else I'll get it all over my resin, which is okay actually, and is another cool effect on its own. I'm going to finish this one with a little hat. Give it a good tap, wipe off a lot, and then a couple more dips with no mattifying step. And my results have 3 layers of color, the bead base and the 2 different pigments. Be aware that without the final baking soda, it's going to take longer to cure, so leave it in there for a good while. Here I tried a vintage glass pearl, putting it right against the tip of wire with no head, just because I wanted it really round. And after a layer of resin, I cured and then dipped in powder to hide that little hole and got this result. Look at how cool these are. I can't wait to use them. I even have these made with faux gold leaf. Again, very messy, but I'm loving the results. Here I experimented with gold flakes over the powder. I made these guys using large grit gold glass glitter, say that 5 times fast, dipping into the resin, swirling in the glitter, and continuing as normal, keeping in mind that it'll take longer to cure without the mattifying step. When you're done, dip your fingers into the cornstarch and rub them into your rag. Do this a few times, and don't worry about the iridescent chameleon flakes. They will dissolve in water, so if you sponge your table and then rinse your sponge, they're gone, and put any clothes into the laundry and they'll just disappear. If you have any questions or doubts as you make these, don't be shy to contact me on my Etsy. And if you want to share your results, I'd be thrilled to see pictures.